Hi, welcome to our presentation about the railroad ferry, the STR Solano. I'm Doug Corliss, joined today by our kid co-host, Toby Randall, and we're honored to have in studio today Bill Rubarth, who is a historian on the Solano and brought this magnificent model into the studio. Bill, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Toby, would you like to start the questions?
I have one main question. Was it for steamies, diesels, or both?
It was only for steam engines. It was for the original transcontinental trains. And later on in the 1930, it was carrying larger steam engines. But diesels didn't come about until the 1940s and 50s.
Oh, was it for passenger, freight, or both?
Both. It carried a lot of trains, both passenger and freight.
When and where did it run?
It ran in California to try to get from San Francisco to Sacramento, and that would be an ideal. So what they did is they built 3 railroads, but they couldn't get to Sacramento directly because west of Sacramento was a very large swamp and rivers and floodplain, and so it's very difficult to cross. So one of the routes was from Oakland south across Niles Canyon and across Altamont Pass, and then they had to go far north to get back to Sacramento. So they built that railroad. They built another one from Vallejo to Sacramento, but they didn't cross the river. And they built another railroad on the south side of the Carquinez Strait that went from Oakland up to Martinez on the south side of the strait. So after they built these railroads, then the transcontinental could go all the way from Chicago all the way to San Francisco, at least to Oakland, and they took a ferry across to San Francisco. In 1879, which was 10 years after the Golden Spike, Leland Stanford got tired of going 120 miles out of his way trying to get down south and across the Altamont Pass and Niles Canyon. And he asked his star architect, engineer, Arthur Brown, to build him a train ferry that would connect the northern tracks to the southern tracks across the Carquinez Strait. So Arthur Brown designed a train ferry that would carry entire trains in 1879. And the same boat lasted until 1930, carrying all the transcontinental trains, all the trains from Sacramento to San Francisco, and also all the trains from Portland, Oregon came down to go to San Francisco, crossed on that boat. It carried both freight and passenger trains and was probably the busiest train ferry in the world, running 36 to 46 trips every day.
Wasn't it the only train ferry in the world?
No, it wasn't the only train ferry. They had to have them across the Mississippi and across other big rivers. So they had other ferries. But few of the ferries ever carried the locomotives in the entire train. They usually just carried the railroad cars.
How far was the crossing that it made?
It was about 1.25 miles crossing. So it was pretty fast. It took 10 minutes.
Whoa.
But the boat left the dock every 30 to 40 minutes.
When it came to load it, you had the locomotive of the train, I'm sure that went on. How many times, they had to break the train and then load different aspects on?
They staged the trains on both sides of the strait so that they could break the trains in half or 3s or 4s, depending on the size of the train. And the locomotive would go on, and then the switchers would push the rest of the cars onto the boat, because they had to get the boat out of there because there was trains already waiting to come the other direction. So you had to get across, get those trains out of the way, and while you're doing that, the other trains coming the other direction had to come on the boat. It was a drive-on and drive-off ferry. The trains came on, the boat went to the other side, the trains drove off. Trains came the other way, got on the boat, boat crossed, and they went off.
So it had to move at a pretty good clip across the strait.
It surely did. To do that, they used the engines of the day were the vertical beam engines. They're called walking beam engines. Sometimes they're called A-frame engines, and they're the ones that actually powered the boat. It's a side paddle wheeler. It's hard to imagine the size of the boat. It was 424 feet long. That's over 1 1/3 football fields. The paddles are 30 feet in diameter, and each one of the walking beam engines developed 2,250 horsepower. The pilot house is 2 stories high, so if you live in a colonial, that's how high that pilot house is. And she lasted for 51 years. The biggest problem is that the original Transcontinental Railway had small locomotives, and they had small railroad cars. And then by 1905, they had to revise the boat again because it was carrying much larger steam engines and railroad cars. And then in 1914, they had to do it again, make it just a little bit, they had to narrow the building so there was more room for the tracks, because then they were using what they call 462 Pacific type locomotives and heavyweight passenger cars built by Pullman. And those were really heavy. They had to have 6-wheel trucks, and they were all metal and cast iron. They were heavy. They even put concrete in the middle of the floor of the railroad car so that the springs wouldn't be locked up, so that they would float back and forth, make it more comfortable for the people.
Oh. Did there have to be a switcher engine at each dock?
Well, yes, there was. There was 3 switchers at one end and 3 switchers at the other end, and there was a special switcher called the boat goat. It's an 060 switcher that was always on the boat.
Oh, I was just asking that because according to the model, it looks like there are a lot of switches.
There are a lot of switches because the trains had to be rejoined, and they also had to be rejoined after they got off the boat so that the trains could go on to either Sacramento or on to San Francisco.
I guess my question is, why build the model of the Solano?
Well, we didn't mean to do that. It took 3 of us. It started off when my friend wanted to build me a sail ship. And I have 5 children, and it probably would have lasted about 15 minutes on a mantle before some kid would have downed it with a volleyball or something. So the answer was no, I couldn't do that. But I said I saw a picture of a train ferry, and that'd be kind of nice. We could use a train ferry for the model railroad, and it would be most fun. So he looked at it, and he was just astounded by that picture, because he says, look at the size of that thing. He says, and look at, it carries the locomotives. That's unheard of. And it's got 2 walking beam engines. No boat ever had 2 walking beam engines. Walking beam engines were very common in that era, 1879. Many boats had those.
What is a walking beam engine?
Well, that's a good question. They built a barrel that was big and it was straight, and they put in a 5-foot diameter piston, and they had boilers that could do 30 psi. Boiler technology was pretty primitive, and the piston would go up and down 11 feet and developed 2,250 horsepower. The piston was made out of wood also, and they put leather and they put grease around it to seal it. They couldn't lay it down so it could go this way, because if they did, the steam would leak out the top. But if they put it vertical, it would balance out and it could go up and down. But then you have to put some guides at the top so that the piston doesn't turn. So you put the guides at the top, and then you have to hinge it to something. And the problem is you have 2,250 horsepower, 50 feet in the air, and what are you going to do with it there? That isn't where the paddle wheels are. So then you put a teeter-totter. That's what the A-frame of wood did, and it had a teeter-totter. So when that piston went up, it pulled the teeter-totter down, and that went down around the crank. And that teeter-totter would just keep going back and forth. And they reinforced it, made it look like a diamond, because it had to had to take the 2,250 horsepower. So that's how the walking beam engine works.
How long did the model take to build? I'm sure it's always a work in progress, but is it near completion?
Yeah, it's near completion. It's been completed for actually 12 years. I'm still working on the trains. Obviously, we just added some extra on the trains. But I built the dock, and my friend Jim Turner built the boat, and it took us each 4 years to put it together. It wasn't just the modeling, it was also the research that we needed to do every time we ran across a stumbling block. The problem is that this was a very large ship. It sailed as part of the Transcontinental Railway. It was probably one of the busiest train ferries in the world. and nobody seemed to know what we were talking about. We contacted the museums, and they said, we don't know what you're talking about. They did have files, but they were way in the back of their systems to find it. So we had to keep digging it out. It took us several trips to California to get all the information. And we just, by that time we realized that this had to be brought back to history. That people needed to know that this was part of our American heritage.
Did you use a lot of glue to make both the model?
Oh, there's a lot of glue, and there's a lot of spikes, and there's a lot of soldering for wires and things.
I can't remember how many spikes you said there are in the boat. You said it in the beginning.
Yes, I did. There were, it's all hand-laid rail. And there's 4,480 spikes on that. Took me all summer to do it. Only 10 minutes at a time. It's too tedious to do much more than that.
When the Solano ran, you said it carried passenger and freight.
Mm-hmm.
But it was by no means a luxury cruiser for the passengers.
No, the passengers stayed on the train pretty much. Once in a while, a local train, if it was waiting for a transcontinental train, they might get a chance to walk the deck or go into the restaurant that's located on the boat. But primarily, they stayed on the train. The sad part of it is, and maybe it's why it was forgotten from history, was that most people never knew they were on a boat, because the pilings blocked your vision of the water, and once you got on the boat, the railroad cars, the passenger cars, are totally enclosed within the boat, so you don't even know you're on a boat.
Until you get off of it?
Yeah, well, you might be able to catch a view when you get off of it. But you're on the other side. You don't know if you crossed it or you're just going along it.
And the planking is all wood.
Yes, the model itself is all wood. It's an all-wood ship. The original boat was all wood. You can imagine a wood boat lasting 51 years of abuse by locomotives and passenger cars. It had to be revised twice, but it's still the same hull.
Obviously, the wood had to be quite heavy, quite thick to support the weight.
Well, actually, what they did is Arthur Brown, the guy that had to design this boat, would built all the bridges and structures, trestles of the original transcontinental railway. So when he was instructed to build the boat, he made 4 large trusses that spanned the entire boat, so that it was very, very strong and it didn't warp. It was 4 bridges, if you want to think of it that way, underneath it, within that boat.
Where was the restaurant on the boat located?
The restaurant on the boat is located on the near side, right about there.
Okay.
And they had to have a restaurant because you had 2 12-hour crews. And so they were pretty tired and they needed to eat. So that's why the restaurant was there, for the crew as well as any passengers that wanted to eat there.
Didn't the cars have dining cars?
Oh yes, on the trains they had dining cars and snack
Well, then
cars.
why couldn't they go to the dining car?
Well, because they couldn't get to the dining car. There's no clearance between the railroad cars. You can't walk the deck with the trains on board.
And if the train was split and you're at this end and the dining car's one track over, it made 4-star dining a little difficult.
Besides that, these the real nice dining cars were for the very rich people, and you didn't want trainmen to be dirtying up your carpeting and everything else while you're eating pheasant, okay?
How many people worked on the crew?
Originally it was 2 12-man crews, and then later it was 2 16-man crews. They did all the docking, they did all the servicing of the boat. They also rebuilt the boilers on the boat. There's 8 boilers on there, and 2 boilers were always being rebuilt while the ship was in operation. And then 2 boilers were spare, and they used the other 4 for the walking beam engines.
Whoa.
Was it a coal or a wood-fired boiler?
Actually, the true history of it is I believe it started off as wood. I don't have any record of that, but it eventually became oil, and then there was a big tragedy on a steamboat blew up on the bay, and they outlawed all oil-fired boilers because the heat was too great, and they had to redo the designs. So for a while she was coal, and then they went back to oil, but the majority of her life she was oil-fired.
Cool.
and it had, obviously it had to have big enough tanks. Did they have to refill
Yes, they did.
every day or twice a day?
No, it didn't really use much energy. It was an amazing boat. They fired up the boilers and got enough steam head to fire up the engines, and about halfway across the mile straight, they shut off the engines and just let the steam carry them through to the dock. And so it was very, very efficient, and they did not use a lot of fuel, so the tanks lasted quite a while.
Did they ever take the boat out of the water to clean the bottom and the paddles, or grease the paddles?
Well, they had taken it out of the service when they were reconfiguring the cabins to make it wider for the larger locomotives and the larger trains.
Okay, the strait that it ran across, I'm sorry, the name of the strait was?
The Carquinez Strait. It's the only water outlet for the huge Central Valley of California. It's that valley is so large; it's about the size of the state of Indiana. And there's only 1 mile wide strait to let that water get onto the very northern bay of San Francisco. It's called San Pablo Bay, and so all the water has to flow through there. But the boat had a lot of problems. The problem being that it was tide, so the tide would go up as much as 8 feet and down 8 feet twice a day. And then it had 13-foot extreme tide. If there was a flood in the rivers or something like that, then the tide could get even higher, 13 feet. So the ramps and the railroads had to accommodate that so that they could go up and down at 13 feet. In addition to that, fog was the biggest problem they had. And they had 3 kinds of fog. They had the San Francisco Bay fog that came in once in a while. They also had river fog. You've seen that where a little lake gets a little covering of fog. But they can get a valley fog, which is incredible. It's an inversion where the Sierra Mountains trap the moist air down below and then they cool it. And that fog is so severe that here in Michigan we get snow days. They get fog days in the Central Valley. So the boats had fog problems. It also had to deal with when the current was going in and out due to the tide, that the current was as much as 8 miles an hour each direction. So this boat had a lot to deal with to get across that strait.
Was the river that the boat crossed connected to the Grand Canyon River?
No, it was connected to the ocean.
Oh.
Through the San Francisco Bay.
I noticed that each end had, what, 4 rudders on it?
Yeah, she has 4 rudders on her, and they only use the rear rudders. That was, it sailed beautifully. The boat never really had problems mechanically. It was a wonderful, reliable boat.
It looks a lot, very symmetrical, so there really wasn't a bow and a stern.
Right. The boat was double-ended. The trains drove on, the boat went across, the trains drove off. The trains came down the other direction, the boat crossed, got off.
When they were loading a train, did a train ever fall off the boat on the opposite end?
Well, it never fell off the boat, but there was a time when a very good engineer, experienced engineer, was transferred to this particular line, and he didn't know that you should not go onto the ramp on the dock. And he came onto the ramp, and you know what happened? What? The engine fell into the water, and you know what they called him after that?
What?
The Admiral.
So he came up,
yeah,
and the boat wasn't
there.
The boat
wasn't there.
So, did it make such a big splash that it splashed part of the crew?
No, it kind of creaked, I think.
And he probably only did it once.
He only did it once, yes.
But other than that, it had a pretty good safety record.
It had a very good safety record. There were people killed and hurt on the boat. In 51 years, people do make mistakes and so forth. So that's kind of sad. But, you know, you're dealing with large, very large equipment in very close quarters, and all that motion of having trains coming on and off and next to each other as they come on. For instance, when they loaded freight cars, the freight train with the locomotive would go on the boat first, and then 3 switchers would simultaneously push all the rest of the cars on there. That's a lot of movement of large railroad cars.
Oh, what did they do to the boat when it went out of service?
Well, when they took it out of service, they would rebuild it, and they would put in new wood where they could, and they widened the cabins, or moved the cabins wider so that the railroad cars could fit in there. And they also put up the bigger posts that were holding the boat together, called hogging posts, to make it stronger, and rebuild the walking beam engines. And then at that time, then they had to run the trains all the way south, the old transcontinental route down to Tracy and across to Altamont Pass and Niles Canyon. So all the trains had to be diverted, created a big traffic jam.
How long did it run until?
It ran until 1930. I like to think that it started off Billy the Kid and ended up in Al Capone's time. To give you some idea, the boat was running 2 years before the shootout at the OK Corral.
What brought about its demise?
Well, they had a second boat in 1914, so now you got two boats running and trying to carry the load. And basically they were overloaded and it was taking longer. They wanted to build a bridge, but they didn't have steel. Once they got steel in the 1920s, they could start contemplating high-level bridges that were strong enough to carry the trains. And so that by 1928, they started on a bridge that replaced this, and then the bridge was finished in 1930. It's a double-track main line of the Southern Pacific. It still exists today.
What happened to the Solano?
Well, they didn't have any use for it anymore, so they had a big party and sailed away for the last trip across the strait. And celebration, of course, they had the big celebration on the bridge. It was technology, it was the new thing, it was great for the railroad. So the boat itself was then stripped of all of its metal and all of its anything of value. And then it was sank as a breakwater in Antioch, California in 1931.
And it's still there today?
And it's still there today. You can still see, not much is left of her. You can still see the hull, and you can see the two. Remember we talked about the A-frames that held the walking beam engine in place. One walking beam is still standing and one fell over, so you can still see that. It's now a historical monument.
So nobody can go in there any further and pillage anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's take a look at the model if we can. Okay, so talking about the planking that's on here, and just on the model, I see 3 locomotives, plus, one might be a switcher, but you had wood planking, and you had a hot locomotive.
And wood bridges.
And wood bridges. How great was the fire danger?
Well, the boats never caught on fire, but the engineers were very respectful of this ship. They loved this ship, so when they came on, they banked their fires and came on with very little smoke, as little as possible, because they didn't even want to dirty the boat. So they kept, you'll notice these bridges here that don't have any smoke on them because the engineers just let steam come out and no smoke. So they were all prepared to be on the boat. So there's no fire risk at all, really. There was fire hoses on the boat in case there was a fire, but it wasn't used for that.
Now that you've got the paddle wheels in motion and we can see the operation of the apron, is this that 11-foot stroke that you spoke of?
That's that 11-foot stroke going up and down, developing 2,250 horsepower.
And you've got it away from the terminal at one end. How did it dock?
Well, the dock was made with a 1,000-square-foot float underneath it, so that the dock always was higher than the boat, regardless of the tide, so that the boat would never touch the end of the dock. So to stop the boat, they used the pilings in a parabola shape, ever increasing radius, if you want to think of it that way. And the idea of that was to take all the forces and distribute them across a larger area, thus making each pressure point less. Basically, it works the same as a woman's sandal. If you can think of a woman's sandal and you push forward on it, the foot does not go any further, but it traps the foot. It also puts it in location. And that's exactly what the dock did. It both stopped it and it lined it up perfectly for that apron. Because if that boat was over by 6 inches, you couldn't have gotten the trains off the track. And this boat's too big to say, let's just move it over. It would have taken winches to move it.
And they never had an issue?
Never had an issue.
Lined up perfect every
And I'll show you how it worked. I'll push the boat to the far side as it enters, and the last ½ inch of travel, it will move over towards me a 1/4 of an inch effortlessly. I'll do it again because it's just so amazing to see. First time it did it, we couldn't believe it. Did you see that move right towards us?
And I'm looking at the if you want to call them the bumpers on the other end.
Mm-hmm.
Those had to be quite substantial.
Oh,
too.
they were. There's 14-inch by 14-inch timbers radiating out of there to take the pressure and to stop this boat. So you actually stop the boat by squeezing it, if you want to think of it that way. But you also align it. So once it gets onto the dock like this, it's never touched the apron, then we can lower the apron down.
Okay.
So to lower the apron, you have to see not only is a 1,000 square foot float underneath there pushing it up the dock, but there's also counterbalances, box of rocks if you want to think of it that way. And in here is a piston that runs on about a 14-foot long cylinder. And when the boat docks, they hook this up to a valve. They turn on a steam-driven pump on both sides. The water is pumped to this side of the piston. The piston pulls this way, and as it pulls that way, it takes this diagonal cable and it lifts it up. And when it lifts it up, it sinks the float because it's no longer balanced. So you lift the weight off, and so then it goes down, and you can see the box of rocks going up, and you can see the 1,000 square foot underneath. It sinks, and then the rails line up perfectly, which is incredible.
Yeah, absolutely, it really is.
Okay.
And this is technology of 1879.
1879. The boat did not have a docking crew. The boat had its own crew that did it. There was nobody on the docks to do this. So that's how that worked.
Can you show us how the trains would get on and off?
Yes, I will.
You have wheelhouses that are quite a bit higher than anything else, that have to turn rudders that are down below water grade. That's a long drop down there.
Yes, well, the rudders, in this case, the front pilot house would control the rudders in the back. That other pilot house would control the rudders that were here.
Makes it even further.
Even further. And in fact, we had a problem, and we'll have to show some close-ups, but we have a double wheel there. It's 12-foot diameter steering wheel. And my friend Jim Turner, who was building the model, said, "Bill, we have a problem. It would take 2 men pushing and 2 men pulling to steer this boat." But we have a photograph that shows that there's a guy inside there, but he's standing in front of the wheels, not even touching the wheels, and he's bringing the boat into the dock. So when we enlarged that picture, we realized that there was another way of steering the boat. So we went back to the original 1890s Transactions of American Civil Engineers, where this was written up in 1890, wow. And we found out that this boat was steered with a lever. It had steam-driven pumps, and the lever was at the top. The shaft went down 50 feet into the hull, and there was a valve there, a 4-way valve, and the man could turn the rudders by merely moving his arm. And they had pistons across the rudders so that the rudders would follow whatever he did on them.
And that had to be duplicated at the other end.
And it was duplicated at the other end. Kind of fly-by-wire for 1879. You know, that's 2 years before the shootout at the OK Corral, you know?
So we've docked the boat,
Mm-hmm.
and in the model you've got 2 steam engines, and I assume
And a
it's
switcher.
a switcher in the back.
Yes.
Which came off first?
Okay, the first train off would be that of the Transcontinental. And then simultaneously the switcher would come off.
The switcher was hooked up to the rear of the Transcontinental?
Yes. We have 2 trains on this boat. It only happened once a day or twice a day maximum. But we had a local train that had come on from Sacramento, and he was on the boat, and they were waiting for the Transcontinental, because the Transcontinental was a very special train. and everybody had to keep that baby on time. So the transcontinental would finally come on, and the switcher would push the second part of the transcontinental train onto the boat, and then the boat would leave. So when the boat docked here, the transcontinental engine would be the first one off. And then the next train to come off would be that of the transcontinental, the local train, excuse me. There's not much clearance on this railroad, just like the real one. The trains would be rejoined further down, and then the transcontinental would be gone. The local train would go up a little bit further. A switcher would come back, pick up these cars, stop off at the station, and go.
The catwalks and all the other access from the ship, and like you said, you could see that they took a lot of pride because everything is clean. And was it difficult to get from the deck up to the wheelhouse? It looks like it was quite an involved climb.
Well, yeah, you had the stairways. The pilot house is 40 feet above the deck, but there's a stairway located here that he could climb up and come up to the pilot house, or he could another stairway here. He could come up and into the pilot house. So you could go back and forth with these. The stairways were you could walk the whole deck on the center cabin.
Mm-hmm. And this was the restaurant and all the other amenities that they offered.
Yeah, this was the restaurant over here. This was the men's room. This was the ladies' room. And this here was a wine room, but Prohibition came along, so they just made it a lounge.
Mm-hmm. And with there wasn't room or quarters for sleeping on this thing.
No, there was no. There were crew's quarters where they could relax in this area right in here, but most of the room was taken up with the boilers, the paddle wheels, more boilers, also the lubricant room where they kept all the oils and all that kind of stuff. Everything lubricated.
This piping here between the boilers, that was, I'm assuming, pressure relief?
There's pressure release for the boilers. It's these vertical pipes. You can see them on either side of the stack. They also ran the steam piping up the stack, and then the steam pipe went across the bridges to the center of the boat where the steam engines were. The boilers were on the outside. 4 boilers under each stack.
You mentioned the spikes. We can see those little spikes, 4,400
180 spikes on the boat, yeah.
And each one driven by hand.
Oh yes, the whole boat was made by hand. The whole dock was made by hand. It's all what they call scratch built.
I noticed through here that there really are no cross ties. It was all just driven right in.
Driven right into the wood,
into
yes.
To the planks.
Mm-hmm.
Can you demonstrate how some of these switches might work if the trains were switching around?
Yeah, I can. We use a pointer.
You could back up this train, then back up this train, then switch this train to this train.
What you do is you put this right in here like this, and then you can turn the switch.
Okay, one thing that I've noticed here with the model is this panel here. What was that?
That panel was a scale. It weighed the railroad cars as they came in. It wasn't large enough to weigh each railroad car, but what we figure is that they were interested in the total weight of the train, so we had some idea what cars were loaded and what cars were not. One story that we read about said that they had a line of tank cars and that they were supposed to be empty, and they put them on the outside track and the boat started to list, and when it started to list they said, these tank cars are not empty, and they pulled them off. We think that what they did now is put in this scale so that as the train crossed it they could tell which cars were empty, which cars were full, and they just wanted to they just wanted so the one truck of one railroad car was here and the other truck was there with a coupler in between, and you could tell whether or not one of the cars was loaded or not.
In the model, does the scale actually work?
No, it does not.
That's what I thought.
Okay, crew access. You had crew, as you said, crew quarters down here for relaxation, but eventually they had to get up to the wheelhouses on either end. Now, were both wheelhouses manned during a crossing?
No, only the front
Forward,
one.
okay.
Forward one, yes.
So it was a pretty long climb for crewmen to get from below decks or on the deck up to the wheelhouse.
Yes. Well, there's a stairway here and a stairway up this direction. One way of getting from the deck to the pilot house. They can also use the stairway in the center building that comes up, and then they can walk up these steps and get to the pilot house. Or if they want to go to the other pilot house because the boat's going to go the other way, they just walk down and just went all the way across and back up into that pilot house.
Was it pretty dangerous walking by those A-frame?
No, it wasn't dangerous at all. The people just, you know, they didn't have all the requirements of today's safety. So yeah, you just followed the handrails around you were fine. There was no danger in falling in.
I noticed in the rear you've got an old Model A back there. Did this also carry some?
It also
vehicular?
carried, well, Port Costa was a little town in a little valley, and it wasn't connected by roads at the beginning with anything else. So it was kind of an island unto itself, if you think of it that way. So if you wanted to drive a car around the town, you had to import the car either by boat or by train. It was easier by boat. And the town of Port Costa was just there as convenience. It wasn't really the destination of anything. It was just there, needed to be there.
We've got a tremendous model. It's certainly keeping the memory of the Solano alive, and I suppose that was your main purpose with
that. Was our main purpose. When we found out that the museums didn't know what we were talking about and asking about, and the people didn't seem to know, then we put our hearts into it. And the more we learned about the boat, the more important and more dynamic the boat became, and we just got excited about it. And so that's why we spent 15 years researching, 4 years building the models and making them, and that's why I show it. It'll eventually be donated to one of 9 museums that would like it very, very much in California.
Well, we're glad you brought it with us today, and Toby, I think you enjoyed this as much as we did.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Okay.
If a train locomotive broke down on the boat, did they have tools to fix it on the boat?
No, they would tow it away and fix it in the shop.
Oh.
They wouldn't leave it on the boat. They couldn't take this boat out of service. In fact, one time the A-frame broke, and it twisted all up because of all that horsepower, and it just crumbled it and tore it all apart. So they, instead of taking the boat out of service, they put a tugboat on it to cover the paddle wheel that didn't work. And they ran back and forth with a tugboat for a while till they got all the parts and got the A-frame straightened out again.
This is a 425-foot
Boat.
and they pulled with a tug.
Well, they only pulled one side with the tug. The other wheel was working fine.
Bill, thank you for bringing this in today. We've enjoyed this immensely. I want to thank Bill. I want to thank our boy co-host, Toby Randall. And I'm Doug Corliss. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.